A heavy silence filled the courtroom, thick with unspoken biases, with the weight of centuries-old prejudice disguised as law and order. The judge, an older white man with a permanent scowl of authority, leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on the desk. His eyes, cold and dismissive, settled on the woman standing before him. He didn't see intelligence. He didn't see strength. He didn't see a person worthy of respect. He saw what he wanted to see, a black woman, standing alone, daring to believe she had any power in his courtroom. She had been brought in under questionable circumstances, an arrest so absurd that even the public defender seemed hesitant to speak, as if the very act of challenging this man's judgment would be seen as an insult. The accusations were flimsy, built on nothing but assumptions and the unspoken rule that blackness itself was enough to justify suspicion. She should have been allowed to walk free immediately, should have had this nonsense dismissed before it even reached this level. But the judge had other plans. He saw this moment as an opportunity, a chance to remind her of what he believed to be the natural order of things. The gavel slammed once, a sharp and deliberate sound that sent a ripple through the room. He leaned forward now, the corners of his mouth curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. His voice was laced with condescension, each syllable deliberately drawn out to make sure everyone in the room felt the weight of his authority. "You people never learn, do you? Always walking around like the rules don't apply to you, like you can just take whatever you want and get away with it," he said, shaking his head as if he was genuinely disappointed. His gaze flickered over her, filled with an ugly amusement. "You should be grateful I'm even letting you speak." She didn't flinch. Not even a blink. But inside there was fire. The kind of fire that had been passed down through generations, the kind of fire that had burned in the eyes of every ancestor who had ever been told to sit down, to be silent, to accept whatever injustice was handed to them. The defense attorney finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, there's no evidence to substantiate these charges," the judge cut him off with a scoff. "Save it. This is open and shut. Some people just don't belong in certain places. And let me tell you something, miss," he said, his voice lowering to something darker, something more insidious. "You don't belong here." A quiet fell over the courtroom, but it wasn't the silence of obedience or submission. It was the silence that comes before a storm, the kind of silence that thickens the air and makes people hold their breath. She let it stretch out for a moment, let the weight of his words hang between them before she finally spoke. "Judge," she said, her voice steady, unreadable, not giving him the reaction he wanted. "Before you make a decision you'll regret, I suggest you take a closer look at who you're talking to." His smirk widened, a predator amused by the prey that didn't know it had already lost. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to. And trust me, you're not special. Just another one of them trying to climb a ladder that was never built for you." She exhaled slowly, reached into her pocket, and placed something on the desk in front of him. A badge. A small, unassuming badge, until you read the inscription. Until you realized what it meant. The Chief Justice of the United States. The shift in the room was immediate. The air changed, the energy cracked like a whip. Whispers spread through the crowd, rippling through the courtroom like an unstoppable wave. The stenographer's hands froze over the keys, the bailiff's eyes widened, the reporters in the back of the room nearly dropped their pens. The defense attorney's mouth fell open in silent disbelief. But the judge. Oh, the judge. His face lost all color in an instant. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the badge as if it were something out of a nightmare, something impossible. His hands trembled slightly as they hovered over his desk, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him all at once, suffocating, inescapable. Because in all his years of wielding power like a weapon, in all the times he had sat in this very chair and passed judgment on others with no consequences, he had never imagined that one day, the very system he thought he controlled would turn against him. The Chief Justice of the United States. Not just a judge. Not just a lawyer. Not just some black woman he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. The highest authority in the country. And she had just watched him condemn himself. Now, the question wasn't whether or not she would walk free. That was already decided. The real question was, what would happen to the man who had built his entire life on prejudice when the world finally saw him for what he really was? Hey there, family. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand strong against racism and discrimination in all its forms. This story isn't just entertainment, it's a reflection of real struggles that many people face every day. If you've ever been underestimated, judged unfairly, or had to fight twice as hard for the same respect, know this: you are powerful, you are worthy, and you deserve justice. Stay strong, stay proud, and keep pushing forward. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And hey, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Let's go. The city of Atlanta buzzed with its usual energy, cars honking in early morning traffic, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, coffee shops filled with hurried conversations. It was a place of history, of resilience, of progress, but also a place where old wounds had never fully healed. The skyscrapers gleamed, modern and ambitious, yet beneath their polished surfaces, shadows of systemic injustice still lingered. The grand courthouse stood at the heart of the city, an imposing structure of white marble and heavy wooden doors, a monument to justice, or at least, to the idea of it. Inside, corridors stretched long and cold, lined with portraits of judges, most of them white, most of them men, their gazes frozen in time, watching, always watching. In one of those courtrooms, Judge Thomas Hamilton had ruled for over 2 decades. To those who knew him, he was a man of unwavering discipline, firm in his convictions, traditional in his beliefs. He wore the black robe like armor, a symbol of his authority, an extension of his power. His reputation was well established, he was tough, unyielding, and, though he would never admit it openly, deeply prejudiced. His rulings consistently reflected a pattern: black defendants faced harsher sentences, minorities rarely won in his courtroom, and any challenge to his authority was met with immediate dismissal. In his eyes, he wasn't racist, he was simply maintaining order, keeping things as they were meant to be. His colleagues, those who shared his social circles, saw him as a man of principle. Old-fashioned, they might say with a chuckle, as if that excused the imbalance of justice in his court. But for those who sat in the defendant's seat, for those who had to face his cold, scrutinizing gaze, there was nothing humorous about his rulings. They knew what he was before he even opened his mouth. A relic of an era that should have died long ago, but somehow, still held power. That morning, as he settled into his chair, he glanced at the case file in front of him. A simple matter, at least in his eyes. A black woman, accused of a white-collar crime. Fraud, embezzlement, one of those cases that, under different circumstances, with a different defendant, might have been dismissed with a fine, a slap on the wrist. But not today. Not in his courtroom. His lips curled slightly as he flipped through the pages. There was something satisfying about these moments, about reminding people of their place, about ensuring that the world continued as he believed it should. She entered the courtroom with measured steps, poised, controlled, as if she already knew the outcome but refused to let it shake her. Her name was Olivia Carter. She was tall, with deep brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes that held a quiet storm beneath them. There was a confidence in her posture, in the way she met his gaze without hesitation. She had been through this before, maybe not this exact situation, but she knew men like him, knew how they operated, knew their type of power and how they wielded it like a weapon. She was a woman who had built herself from the ground up, who had faced obstacles at every stage of her life but had never let them stop her. Raised in a working-class family in the South, she had seen firsthand how the system worked against people like her, how justice often had 2 different faces depending on who was sitting on the other side of the bench. That knowledge had fueled her, driven her to pursue law, to climb higher and higher, to break barriers others had told her were impossible to break. The accusation against her was absurd. A fabricated case, flimsy and desperate, built on a foundation of assumptions rather than facts. But she knew the truth wouldn't matter in this courtroom. The moment she had walked through those doors, her fate had already been decided. The prosecutor, a younger man eager to please the system that had elevated him, presented the case with rehearsed confidence, painting Olivia as someone who had manipulated the system for personal gain. His words were precise, calculated to fit the narrative that people like Judge Hamilton wanted to hear. A black woman with power? That alone was reason enough for suspicion in their eyes. Her defense attorney, Michael Brooks, knew they were walking into a losing battle. He had defended countless cases in this very courtroom and had seen firsthand how little facts mattered, and the judge had already made up his mind. Still, he had to try. He had to fight. He argued with everything he had, presenting evidence that dismantled the prosecution's weak accusations, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies, the lack of concrete proof. But he could see it in Judge Hamilton's face, the way his fingers tapped impatiently, the way he barely glanced at the documents presented. He wasn't listening. And then, the moment came. The moment where the judge leaned forward, clasped his hands together, and let out a slow, deliberate sigh, as if he were entertaining a child who had wasted enough of his time. "You're quite articulate, Mr. Brooks, I'll give you that," Hamilton said, his tone dripping with false patience. His gaze flickered to Olivia, lingering just long enough to make it clear that he didn't see a person standing before him, he saw something else. "But let's not drag this out. We both know where this is going." Olivia held his stare, unflinching. "Do we?" His smirk deepened. "Oh, we do. And let me be clear about something. This courtroom isn't a stage for theatrics. You might think your fancy degree makes you special, but here, you are just another defendant, and I suggest you remember that before you embarrass yourself any further." A hushed murmur rippled through the room. Even the spectators, those used to seeing injustice unfold, felt the weight of the moment. Michael Brooks opened his mouth, ready to protest, but Olivia lifted a hand, stopping him. She didn't need saving. She reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, as every eye in the room watched. She pulled out a small, polished badge and placed it on the judge's desk, right in front of him. The silence that followed was unlike anything that courtroom had ever experienced. Judge Hamilton's eyes dropped to the badge, and for a moment, he didn't process what he was seeing. Then, the realization hit. His breath caught, his fingers twitched ever so slightly. His expression, once so smug, so sure of himself, shifted into something else entirely. Something rare. Fear. Because that badge wasn't just any badge. It wasn't a lawyer's ID, not a simple credential. It bore the seal of the United States Supreme Court. And beneath that seal, the words that would unravel everything he had built in an instant, Chief Justice of the United States. In that moment, everything changed. The power dynamic he had relied on, the authority he had wielded without consequence, crumbled beneath him. The woman he had tried to dismiss, to humiliate, to control, she was the highest legal authority in the country. And now, as the room held its breath, as the weight of his own prejudice came crashing down on him, there was only one question left: what happens when the man who thought he controlled justice finds himself at its mercy? The weight of the badge on Judge Hamilton's desk felt heavier than anything he had ever held in his hands before. His fingers twitched, hovering above it as if touching it might burn him, as if the reality it represented was too much for his mind to process. The room had fallen into an unnatural silence, so thick, so absolute, that even the sound of breathing felt intrusive. Every set of eyes was locked onto him, waiting, watching. Olivia Carter stood unwavering before him, her expression unreadable, her posture firm. She didn't need to say another word. The moment had already spoken for itself. Hamilton's chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths. His world had shifted in an instant, the very ground beneath him cracking, threatening to swallow him whole. The smugness he had worn so effortlessly, the authority he had wielded without consequence, had vanished. This wasn't just a challenge to his power. This was a revelation, a collision between the reality he had built for himself and the truth he had refused to acknowledge. And the truth was standing in front of him, watching him unravel. The prosecutor, sitting just a few feet away, swallowed hard, his knuckles white from how tightly he was gripping his pen. He, too, had been riding on Hamilton's confidence, thinking this was just another case, another moment of exerting their control over someone they deemed unworthy of respect. Now, he looked between the judge and Olivia, realization settling deep in his bones. There would be consequences. Severe ones. Hamilton finally found his voice, but it was strained, lacking the certainty it once carried. This is a joke. His fingers tightened into a fist before unclenching again, a physical manifestation of his internal war. This is a courtroom, not some political stunt. I don't care what badge you throw on my desk. It doesn't change the fact that you're standing here accused. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying him, as if deciding how much grace to afford him in this moment. What it changes, Your Honor, she said, her voice smooth and steady, is who you're talking to. And what that means for the decisions you've made here today. Hamilton could feel the sweat gathering at the nape of his neck. The courtroom wasn't just watching anymore. It was judging him, dissecting him, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the man he truly was. He could see it in the jurors, in the court clerks, in the stenographer whose fingers had frozen mid-sentence. The balance of power was shifting, and it was slipping fast. Michael Brooks, Olivia's attorney, finally leaned forward, breaking the suffocating tension. His voice was measured, but there was a sharpness to it now, a confidence he had lacked before. I'd like to make a motion to dismiss all charges immediately. Hamilton's head snapped toward him, his lips parting as if to protest, but for the first time in his life, the words refused to come. His mind raced through every possible way out of this, every argument he could twist in his favor, but they all led to dead ends. There was no more control. No more narrative to manipulate. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Olivia finally leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping into something lower, something that sent chills down Hamilton's spine. You don't want to be remembered for what happens next. The meaning behind her words was clear. This wasn't just about this case anymore. This was about him, his career, his legacy, the inevitable downfall that would come if he dared to follow through with what he had started. He had spent decades sitting behind that bench, thinking himself untouchable. But he wasn't untouchable anymore. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the bailiff, then to the jury, then to the press in the back of the room. The reporters had caught on now, their pens moving furiously, their phones subtly capturing pieces of this historic moment. If he made the wrong choice, it would be the only thing anyone remembered about him. His hand trembled as he reached for the gavel, hesitating. Then, with a sharp breath, he slammed it down once. The echoing sound cut through the room like a gunshot. This case is, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Hamilton's heart nearly stopped. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance as two high-ranking federal officers stepped inside, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. Their presence sent an immediate ripple of unease through the space, a silent acknowledgement that something much bigger had just entered the equation. One of the officers, a black woman with an air of authority that rivaled even Olivia's, stepped forward. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lighting as she pulled out a folded document and held it up. Judge Thomas Hamilton, you are hereby placed under federal investigation for judicial misconduct, abuse of power, and racial discrimination in sentencing practices. The words landed like a sledgehammer. A visible jolt ran through Hamilton's body, his fingers gripping the desk as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. This is a mistake, he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own disbelief. I've served this court for years. I have upheld the law. The officer's gaze remained steady. And now, the law is upholding itself against you. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled into something closer to an uproar. The very people who had once feared him, who had once accepted his rulings as final, were now whispering about his downfall, about the irony of a man so devoted to punishing others and now facing judgment himself. Hamilton's breath came faster. His pulse pounded against his temples. This couldn't be happening. He had built a career on control, on being the one who decided fates, and now he was the one on trial. Olivia didn't move. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in his unraveling. She simply watched, as if she had already known this day would come, as if she had always understood that justice, real justice, was patient. It didn't have to chase. It simply waited. The officers stepped closer. "Judge Hamilton, please stand." His fingers dug into the edge of his desk. His pride, his anger, his fear all battled inside him, a storm raging in a man who had never thought himself capable of weakness. And yet, as he slowly rose to his feet, as his knees threatened to buckle under him, as he realized the cameras were now turned toward him, capturing the fall of a man who once thought himself untouchable, the only thing left for him to do was ask himself one terrifying question. What happens when the executioner becomes the condemned? The courtroom air had turned suffocating, thick with tension, with the weight of something irreversible. Judge Thomas Hamilton stood motionless, his breath uneven, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. The two federal officers remained in place, waiting, their presence a physical embodiment of the reality he refused to accept. Olivia Carter hadn't moved from where she stood. She didn't need to. She had already won, not just the case, but something far greater. The very system that Hamilton had manipulated and weaponized against people like her had finally turned its sights on him. And there was no escape. His mouth opened, then closed. His mind raced for something, anything, that could undo this moment, but there was no argument that could erase the truth. The walls of the courthouse, which had always been his domain, now felt like they were closing in on him. The murmurs in the gallery had grown into something heavier, something close to satisfaction, the sound of a balance long overdue finally shifting. "This is outrageous," he finally managed, though his voice lacked the authority it once carried. It was thinner now, laced with something unfamiliar. Desperation. "I have upheld the law with integrity for decades." "You have no grounds to, Judge Hamilton," the female officer interrupted, stepping forward, her expression unchanging. "A formal complaint has been filed against you by the Federal Justice Oversight Committee, citing repeated instances of judicial misconduct, racial bias in sentencing, and obstruction of due process. You are being placed under immediate investigation. You will be required to step down from the bench effective immediately pending the results of this inquiry." The words hit like a hammer to the chest. His legs wobbled beneath him. His life's work, his career, everything he had built, it was slipping through his fingers. He looked at Olivia, his mind burning with resentment, with disbelief that this was happening, that she was the one standing there, watching him fall. His lips curled into something bitter. "You did this." She tilted her head slightly, unshaken. "I didn't have to. You did it to yourself." His jaw clenched. He had spent years making sure this courtroom remained his kingdom, making sure that people like her never rose above where he thought they belonged. And now, she was standing over him, not because of some trick, not because of some loophole, but because he had finally been held accountable for his own actions. The male officer took a step forward, pulling out a document, unfolding it slowly, deliberately. "Judge Hamilton, you are being served with an official notice of investigation by the Office of Judicial Conduct. You are to surrender your judicial credentials, and you will be required to appear for an ethics hearing before the Supreme Court within 30 days. If found guilty of misconduct, you will face immediate disbarment, removal from your position, and potential criminal charges." A hush spread across the room. The power shift was absolute now. The once untouchable judge was standing on trial in his own courtroom, in front of the very people he had spent years judging, condemning, dismissing. He swallowed hard, forcing down the bile that rose in his throat. His mind screamed for a way out. There had to be a way out. His eyes snapped to the prosecutor, the young man who had once been his eager ally. "Do something," Hamilton hissed under his breath, his voice barely audible but sharp with unspoken threats. "Fix this." The prosecutor, whose hands had gone clammy, shook his head slowly, panic flashing behind his eyes. I can't. There's nothing I can do." Hamilton's heart pounded against his ribs, a deep, frantic thudding that sent chills down his spine. He had been the one holding the gavel, the one delivering judgment, always so sure of himself. Now, for the first time, he was the one being judged. His gaze flicked back to Olivia, and this time, there was something different in his eyes. A flicker of something raw. Fear. She took a step closer, closing the space between them, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear. "This is what real justice looks like. Not power. Not privilege. Justice." His breath hitched. A lifetime of control, of unchecked authority, of decisions that no one had dared question, erased in a single moment. The courtroom doors swung open once more. A group of judicial officials entered, their presence signaling the next step in the process. One of them, a stern-looking woman in a tailored navy suit, approached the bench, her expression devoid of sympathy. "Judge Hamilton," she said crisply, "you are hereby relieved of your judicial duties effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." His legs locked. Escort him? Like some common criminal? No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be his fate. The bailiff, a man who had worked under him for years, hesitated before stepping toward the bench. Hamilton's stomach twisted. He had given orders in this courtroom. He had been the one people feared. And now, they were looking at him like he was nothing. His fingers curled into fists. He wanted to fight it, wanted to argue, to shout, to threaten. But his voice had lost its weight. His authority had been stripped. As the officers moved closer, as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, as the press captured every second of his downfall, he understood, in the deepest part of himself, that this moment would define him forever. Not the years on the bench. Not the countless cases he had ruled over. This. The moment he lost everything. And as he was led away, his robes feeling heavier than ever, his head throbbing with the humiliation of it all, the only thing left to wonder was what came next. Because for the first time in his life, Thomas Hamilton was at the mercy of a system he had spent decades believing would never turn against him. The hallway outside the courtroom was thick with the weight of whispered conversations, the sharp sting of disbelief hanging in the air, the silent but unmistakable shift of power that had just taken place. The walls, once lined with faces of judges long revered, now seemed to close in, suffocating, pressing against Judge Thomas Hamilton as he walked, each step heavier than the last. The gavel had been his weapon, his word had been law, his authority had been unquestioned, until now. His presence, once commanding, was now an object of scrutiny, of curiosity, of something far worse, recognition. People saw him now, truly saw him, but not as the untouchable figure of justice he had once been. They saw a man exposed, stripped of his untarnished reputation, reduced to someone who could no longer dictate the course of others' lives without consequence. His hands, which had once delivered countless verdicts with unwavering confidence, trembled slightly, fingers twitching at his sides. He willed them to be still, willed his breath to remain even, willed himself not to acknowledge the shift in the air, the way the courthouse staff he had once overlooked now seemed to be watching him, not with respect, but with something else. Something closer to satisfaction. As he reached the corridor leading to the exit, his chest tightened. He had spent years walking these halls without a second thought, with his head high, with certainty in every step. Now, each footfall felt like a weight dragging him further into something irreversible. And there, standing at the far end of the hall, waiting with the same measured patience she had displayed in the courtroom, was Olivia Carter. She was still. Not smug, not gloating, not reveling in the moment as he might have expected. Instead, she simply stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Her presence burned through him more than any of the whispers, more than the cameras that were no doubt waiting outside, more than the murmured conversations happening just out of earshot. She had been the one to unravel him, to peel away the layers of power and privilege that had kept him insulated for so long. And yet, there was no triumph in her eyes, only the quiet, unwavering certainty of someone who had always known this day would come. He forced his breathing to steady, his chin tilting up slightly, grasping for the remnants of dignity that still clung to him. His voice, though strained, carried the sharp edge of a man refusing to surrender completely. "You think this is justice?" The words came out slower than he intended, deliberate, as if speaking them aloud might force her to reconsider, to see that he was still a man of the law, still someone who had upheld the system, not destroyed it. Olivia's gaze didn't waver, didn't so much as flicker under the weight of his words. "I think this is accountability." Something inside him twisted. He had heard that word thrown around before, but never in his direction. It was a word meant for others, for people who had truly overstepped, for those who had broken the law, not enforced it. But here, standing in front of the woman whose future he had been so ready to condemn, it felt different. It felt like a reckoning. His fingers curled into fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "This is a political move," he bit out, needing to make sense of the chaos unraveling around him. "You and your people, you wanted me out of that courtroom long before today. You don't care about fairness. You just want revenge." A slow exhale left Olivia's lips, something between disbelief and resignation settling over her features. She took a measured step forward, closing the space between them ever so slightly, her voice lowering just enough to carry an edge that made his stomach clench. "Revenge?" She let the word settle between them for a moment, as if weighing its absurdity before speaking again. "You think this is about revenge? After everything you've done?" Hamilton didn't move, didn't breathe. "You spent decades hiding behind that bench, pretending you were impartial, pretending that your rulings were about justice and not about power. You looked at people like me and decided before we even stepped foot in your courtroom that we were guilty. You gave harsher sentences, dismissed legitimate defenses, denied people the right to a fair trial just because you could. And now that it's you standing on the other side of it, you think it's unfair." His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his mouth suddenly dry. "You didn't uphold the law, Hamilton. You weaponized it." His breath hitched. "And now, for the first time in your life, the system isn't protecting you." His entire body tensed, but he had no rebuttal, no carefully crafted argument to undo what had just been spoken. Because deep down, in the part of himself he refused to acknowledge, he knew she was right. He had built his authority on the belief that no one would ever come for him, that no one would ever question the way he ruled. And yet, standing there, staring into the eyes of the very woman he had tried to destroy, he understood with devastating clarity that he had been wrong. The hallway stretched ahead, but it no longer felt like the space he had ruled over for decades. It felt smaller, suffocating, like a corridor leading to something unknown. And just as he reached the door, just as he tried to force himself to breathe, Olivia's voice came one last time, quiet but sharp as a blade. "You always thought people like me didn't belong in your courtroom. That we weren't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. But tell me something, Judge Hamilton, how does it feel to know that, in the end, it was you who didn't belong there?" The words hit him with the force of a verdict. He wanted to turn, to snap back, to deny it, to say anything that would reassert the control that had slipped so violently from his grasp. But there was nothing left to say. He pushed open the door and stepped outside. The press was waiting. A wall of flashing cameras, microphones, reporters with eager, sharpened questions on the tips of their tongues. The courthouse, which had once been his domain, his kingdom, was now nothing more than the backdrop to his public downfall. The voices came from all directions, overlapping, relentless. Judge Hamilton, do you have any comment on the allegations against you? Do you deny the accusations of racial bias in your rulings? Will you be resigning permanently? His ears rang, his vision blurred slightly from the intensity of the lights. He had never been on this side of justice before. Never felt its cold, merciless gaze pressing down on him, demanding answers. Then, one last question cut through the chaos, clear and deliberate, a dagger in the open wound of his reality. Do you feel the same way about the justice system now that you're on the other side of it? Something inside him cracked. His mouth opened, but no words came. Because for the first time in his life, for the first time since he had sat on that bench, since he had controlled the fate of so many, since he had handed down sentences with the certainty of a man who believed in his own invincibility, he didn't know what justice was supposed to feel like. The air outside the courthouse was thick with the frenzy of the media, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of flashing cameras and relentless questions, each one clawing for a reaction, for a soundbite, for some desperate attempt at control from the man who had just lost everything. Judge Thomas Hamilton stood frozen at the top of the courthouse steps, his vision slightly blurred from the strobe-like assault of camera flashes, his breath tight in his chest. The world was watching. The same world that had once regarded him with authority, with unquestioned respect, with deference. But now, that world had turned on him. The weight of his own legacy, the years of rulings, the courtroom victories, the absolute power he had wielded without a second thought, none of it mattered anymore. It had been stripped from him in mere minutes, peeled away like an old coat he could no longer wear. The questions continued, insistent, biting, pressing in on him from all sides. A younger reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand, his expression a mixture of curiosity and calculated interest. Judge Hamilton, do you believe you've been treated unfairly? Do you think the system has failed you? The word struck him like a slap. His lips parted, but nothing came out. The hypocrisy of the question hung in the air, and for the first time in his life, he felt what so many had felt before him in his courtroom, the sheer weight of being powerless in the face of a system designed to crush those without protection. It was ironic, wasn't it? That after years of dismissing appeals, shutting down defenses, delivering judgments with the swift coldness of a man who never had to fear consequence, he now stood in the very position he had forced so many into. But he wasn't one of them. He wasn't. That was what he wanted to believe. That was what he had to believe. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his temple. He clenched his jaw, forcing his expression into one of practiced neutrality, a remnant of the composure he had always carried inside the courtroom. No comment, he finally managed, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. He turned sharply, pushing forward, but the crowd wasn't done with him. Another voice called out, this time from a woman with a press badge hanging from her neck, her voice steady but firm. Judge Hamilton, how do you respond to the allegations that your sentencing patterns disproportionately targeted black and minority defendants? His stomach twisted, his fingers curling into his palms. He had heard these accusations before, of course, whispers among activists, critiques in legal circles, opinion pieces written by people who wanted to paint him as a villain. But they had never mattered. He had always been insulated, untouchable, protected by the very institution he had served. And now, standing here under the unflinching gaze of cameras and flashing lights, those whispers had become fact. Evidence. The press was relentless, sensing his unease, the way his shoulders stiffened, the flicker of something like panic behind his eyes. Judge Hamilton, do you regret any of your rulings? Do you feel any remorse for the people whose lives you may have impacted unfairly? His head snapped toward the reporter, his teeth grinding together. Remorse? They wanted to know if he regretted the decisions he had made, the sentences he had handed down with unwavering confidence. He had done his job. He had followed the law. He had upheld the structure of justice that had existed long before he ever sat on that bench. And yet, something deep inside him, something cold and uneasy, gnawed at the edges of his certainty. The weight of Olivia Carter's words still lingered, pressing into his skull like a phantom pain he couldn't shake. You weaponized the law. And now, for the first time in your life, the system isn't protecting you. His throat felt dry, his chest tight. He had spent his life convincing himself that fairness and justice were the same thing, that the law, as it was written, was absolute, unshaped by personal biases, unaffected by race, by status, by privilege. But standing here, with the world staring at him as if he were something to be dissected, he realized that he had never truly believed in fairness. He had believed in control. And now, without it, who was he? A sudden hush fell over the press as the courthouse doors opened again. He didn't have to turn to know who had stepped outside. He could feel her presence behind him like a shadow stretching across the steps, unwavering and solid. Olivia Carter walked past him, her heels clicking against the pavement with the ease of someone who had nothing to fear. The reporters turned to her, their attention shifting effortlessly. They knew where the real power lay now. A microphone was raised toward her, and the question came swift, cutting through the static hum of the crowd. Chief Justice Carter, do you have anything to say about today's events? She exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, her voice clear. Today is a reminder that justice is not about who holds the most power. It is about accountability. And no one, not even those who have worn the robe of a judge, should be exempt from it. Her words sliced through the air like a blade, a declaration not just of what had happened today, but of what was still to come. Because this wasn't over. The investigation would continue. The hearings would begin. The empire Hamilton had built around himself had already crumbled, but the pieces of it would continue to fall, each revelation exposing what had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Hamilton turned away, pushing through the mass of cameras and reporters, his mind racing, his breath short. He needed distance. Space. Somewhere to think. But there was nowhere left to run. The doors that had once opened freely for him were closing, the people who had once shielded him were disappearing, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, utterly alone. The car waiting for him at the curb was the only thing that felt familiar, but even as he slipped inside, slamming the door behind him, he knew that no amount of tinted windows or locked doors could shut out what had already begun. He had spent decades looking down from his bench, passing judgment, believing that the consequences of his decisions would never return to him. But the system had finally turned its gaze toward him. And there was nothing left for him to do but face it. The car moved through the streets of Atlanta in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of a passing pedestrian. Judge Thomas Hamilton sat rigid in the back seat, his hands clenched together in his lap, his eyes staring out the window without really seeing anything. The city stretched before him, vibrant and alive, yet for the first time in his life, it felt foreign. Unrecognizable. It had been his city once. A place where his name carried weight, where his presence commanded respect. But now, it was different. He could feel it in the way people looked at him through the tinted windows, in the way the streets no longer felt like something he controlled but something that had outgrown him. His driver didn't speak. He always did, always made some small comment about the day, about the weather, about the latest news, but today, there was nothing. Just the occasional glance in the rearview mirror, quick and unreadable. Hamilton knew what that silence meant. He could feel it, heavy in the air. The world had already shifted. The trial hadn't even started, and yet he was already condemned, already judged by the court of public opinion. The same system he had once ruled over had flipped, and now he was the one being examined under a microscope. It was unbearable. His fingers tapped against his knee, restless, agitated. He needed something, anything, to ground him, to remind himself that he was still Thomas Hamilton, still the man who had commanded a courtroom, who had shaped the law, who had never once doubted his own authority. He reached into his pocket, searching for his phone. The moment his fingers brushed against the smooth surface, he felt a flicker of control, of something tangible in a world that was suddenly slipping through his grasp. He unlocked it, his eyes scanning the screen, looking for messages, for emails, for something to prove that not everyone had turned against him. But the notifications that greeted him weren't ones of support. They were headlines, alerts, breaking news stories, each one hammering another nail into the coffin of his reputation. Judge Thomas Hamilton under federal investigation for judicial misconduct. Former defendants speak out against Hamilton's sentencing biases. Chief Justice Olivia Carter calls for accountability in the legal system, a career built on injustice. The reckoning of Thomas Hamilton. His throat tightened. His grip on the phone grew painful. He scrolled faster, searching for something different, something that countered the narrative, something that reaffirmed what he had always believed about himself. But it wasn't there. Instead, there were interviews, clips of people he had sentenced speaking out, sharing their stories, recounting the way their lives had been shaped, destroyed by the rulings he had handed down so easily. A familiar name caught his eye. His breath stalled in his chest. Michael Gaines. He remembered him. A young black man, barely 20 at the time, accused of a nonviolent drug offense. A first-time offender, no prior record. The prosecution had pushed for leniency. Hamilton had denied it. 10 years. He had handed down the sentence without a second thought, without a single flicker of doubt. And now, there was Gaines, sitting in an interview chair, his voice calm but weighted with something undeniable. "I never stood a chance in that courtroom," Gaines was saying, his hands clasped together, his eyes steady. "You walk in, and you already know what's going to happen. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what the evidence says. When you're black, and you're standing in front of someone like Judge Hamilton, you're already guilty. He never even looked at me like a person. Just another case file. Just another number." Hamilton's grip on the phone trembled. He forced himself to look away, but the word stayed, burned into his brain, digging under his skin. Just another case file. Just another number. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, strained. "Turn off the news." The driver didn't move. For a moment, Hamilton thought he might ignore him, might pretend he hadn't heard. But then, with a small nod, the radio clicked off, and the silence in the car became even heavier. The drive stretched on, the familiar streets winding past, but they no longer felt familiar. They felt hostile. Like he was an intruder in a world that had already decided he didn't belong. And then, as if the day hadn't already unraveled beyond repair, his phone vibrated in his hands. A name flashed across the screen. His wife. He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the screen. Then, slowly, he answered. Her voice came through immediately, sharp and cold. "What the hell is happening, Thomas?" His jaw locked. He exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. "It's being blown out of proportion." "The media, don't," she snapped, cutting him off. "Don't give me that. I just got a call from the firm. Do you have any idea how bad this is? Do you have any idea what people are saying? My name is being dragged into this, our children's names are being dragged into this. You told me this would never happen. You told me there was nothing to worry about." He squeezed his eyes shut, the pounding in his head intensifying. "I didn't think, that's the problem, Thomas. You never thought this would touch you. You thought you could just keep doing what you were doing, keep making the same decisions, keep running that courtroom like it was your own damn kingdom, and that nothing would ever come back to you." His stomach twisted. His wife had always been his strongest supporter, always defended him, always stood by him. But there was something in her voice now that he had never heard before. Something like resentment. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Make time," she snapped. "Because I'm telling you right now, Thomas, I'm not going to watch our entire lives crumble because of your arrogance. You need to fix this. I don't care what you have to do, who you have to talk to, what strings you have to pull. But you fix this. Or I walk. His breath stalled. She had never threatened that before. Not once. The line went dead before he could say another word. He stared at the phone in his hands, his mind racing, his heart pounding. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life, he realized there was no way out. No easy solution. No loophole to exploit. For the first time in his life, Thomas Hamilton was truly, undeniably powerless. The house was dark when Thomas Hamilton stepped inside, the quiet wrapping around him like something heavy, something suffocating. The weight of the day clung to him like a second skin, every muscle in his body stiff with exhaustion, his mind clouded with the remnants of conversations that had shaken him down to his very core. He had walked into that courthouse this morning a judge, a man who commanded a room with a single look, a single word, a single strike of the gavel. He had walked out of it something else entirely. And now, standing in the dim silence of his own home, he felt like a stranger in a place that had once been his sanctuary. The house was too quiet. His wife wasn't waiting for him. There was no greeting, no warmth, no moment of solace to counterbalance the storm raging outside. It was deliberate, he knew that. He had heard it in her voice on the phone, the exhaustion, the barely restrained fury, the deep, cutting disappointment. She wasn't here because she didn't want to see him, didn't want to face him, didn't want to be near the man whose decisions had led them to this exact moment. He exhaled slowly, dropping his coat onto the back of the chair, his movements slower than usual, heavier. He made his way to the study, pouring himself a drink with the kind of mechanical precision that came from habit, from control, from the desperate need to cling to something familiar. The ice clinked against the glass, the amber liquid swirling as he brought it to his lips, but the relief he was looking for didn't come. It never did anymore. The headlines were still running through his mind, the voices from the press still echoing in his ears, the weight of Olivia Carter's words still pressing against his chest like a force that wouldn't let up. The system isn't protecting you anymore. That was what she had said. That was the truth he had spent the entire day trying not to look in the eye. Because what was he without that system? Who was he without the black robe, without the bench, without the absolute power that had defined him for decades? He sat down slowly, his fingers gripping the glass tighter than necessary, staring at the bookshelves lining the study walls. Books on law. Books on precedent. Books on justice. He had built his life around those words, had built his entire identity around the idea that he was the one who interpreted them, enforced them, shaped them to fit the world as he saw it. But now, those same laws were turning against him. He had always believed that justice was something fixed, something unyielding, something that could be wielded with certainty. But tonight, sitting in the quiet of his own home, with the weight of his own actions pressing down on him, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. The front door opened. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. His body tensed before he even turned his head. His wife stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor, her movements brisk, purposeful. She didn't look at him immediately. She set her purse down, her coat following, and when she finally did turn, her expression was unreadable. But he knew that look. He had seen it before, on attorneys in the courtroom, on people standing before him, waiting for judgment. She was angry. He braced himself. She didn't sit. She stood across from him, arms crossed, her stance one of quiet fury. Do you have any idea what today has been like for me? His throat tightened. He took a sip of his drink before answering, though it did little to dull the sharpness of her tone. I know it's been difficult. Her laugh was short, humorless. Difficult? She shook her head, disbelief flashing across her face. Thomas, I had to cancel 2 meetings because my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I walked into my office, and people were looking at me like I was a walking scandal. Do you understand what that feels like? He exhaled slowly. This will pass. No, she said sharply, stepping forward, her voice hardening. It won't. You're under a federal investigation. Your name is all over the news. This isn't just a bad day. This is the end of everything you've built. Everything we've built." He looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to face it. He had spent the entire day fighting against this exact moment, against the reality that was pressing down on him now with unbearable force. She wasn't done. "I stood by you for years, Thomas. I defended you. When people said you were too harsh, I said you were just upholding the law. When people questioned your rulings, I said you were fair. Do you know how that makes me feel now? Knowing that I defended a man who never once stopped to consider whether the power he wielded was destroying lives." His head snapped toward her. "I did what was right. I upheld the law." Her eyes flashed. "No, Thomas. You upheld your version of the law. The version that made sense to you. The version that let you sleep at night while other people lost their futures because of the decisions you made so damn easily." His grip on the glass tightened, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. "And now," she continued, her voice quieter but no less sharp, "you're finally feeling what it's like to be on the other side of it." The words sent a cold shiver through him. "You think this is unfair," she went on, stepping closer, her gaze unwavering. "You think you're being targeted, being torn down. But tell me, Thomas, how many people stood in front of you in that courtroom, begging you to reconsider, pleading for a second chance, asking for fairness? How many people's lives did you send spinning out of control while you sat there believing you were untouchable?" He looked away, his fingers pressing into his temple, his head pounding. "That's not the same." She scoffed. "Isn't it?" Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She exhaled, shaking her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more exhausted than angry. "I don't know if I can stay in this." His breath stalled. "I don't know if I can stand by you while the world burns around us. While our children's names get dragged into something they had no part in. While I have to watch you sit there, refusing to see what's right in front of you." His stomach twisted, a feeling creeping in that he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not of the trial. Not of the investigation. But of losing everything, everyone that had ever mattered to him. She turned then, walking toward the stairs. But before disappearing from view, she stopped, her back still to him. "Figure out what kind of man you want to be, Thomas. Because if you think you're the victim in this, you have a lot to learn." Then she was gone. He sat there in the silence, staring at the place where she had stood, his chest tight, his mind an unrecognizable mess of thoughts, of doubt, of a deep, hollow realization creeping in from the shadows. For the first time in his life, Thomas Hamilton wasn't sure of anything. The hearing was set. The courtroom was no longer his, the power no longer his to wield. The weight of the wooden benches, the gaze of the public, the sharp glances of legal representatives, they all carried a different meaning now. Thomas Hamilton sat at the defendant's table, not at the bench he had occupied for decades, but in the very seat he had condemned others to sit in. The irony was suffocating. The trial itself was not criminal, not yet, but the implications were devastating. The Judicial Conduct Committee had launched a full-scale review into his sentencing history, his biases, his misconduct, and the very foundation of the career he had built with such cold certainty was now being picked apart, piece by piece, case by case. He could feel the judgment, the scrutiny, the silent weight of consequences finally catching up to him. The room had once bent to his presence, but now, he was just another man at the mercy of a system that had always served him, until now. The evidence was undeniable. Decades of rulings painted an ugly, inescapable picture. Patterns that could no longer be explained away, statistics that exposed the quiet injustices he had dismissed as procedural routine. There were testimonies, names he barely remembered, faces that had blurred together over years of sentencing people without a second thought. Olivia Carter sat among the committee, her expression calm but unwavering, the very embodiment of justice, not as power, but as balance, as correction. She wasn't here for revenge, wasn't here for spectacle, she was here to ensure that the system Hamilton had misused for so long was no longer his shield. She watched without gloating, without cruelty, because she knew his greatest punishment wasn't the investigation itself, but the realization that he had lost everything he had once taken for granted. The verdict was handed down swiftly, his judicial career was over. He was permanently removed from the bench, disbarred from practicing law, and his name, once associated with power and finality, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale of unchecked arrogance and systemic failure. He would face further review for criminal misconduct, and though the legal battles ahead would be drawn out and uncertain, one thing was clear: he would never sit in judgment again. The press swarmed as he stepped out of the courthouse, but there was no fight left in him. The man who had once stood tall, who had once dictated the fate of others with absolute certainty, now carried the unmistakable posture of someone who had been defeated by the very thing he once controlled. He walked past the cameras, past the reporters demanding a statement, past the very public he had ignored for so long. He had nothing to say. Time passed. The world moved on, as it always did. New cases filled the courts, new names occupied the news cycles, new stories demanded attention. Thomas Hamilton faded into the background of a justice system that no longer belonged to him. He lost everything. His marriage, strained beyond repair, unraveled. His reputation, once unshakable, became a cautionary tale of what happens when power is left unchecked. And the city that had once looked at him with fear or respect now barely acknowledged his presence. He was just another man, stripped of the authority he had believed made him untouchable. He lived quietly, out of the public eye, without the security of the life he had once known. But his story didn't end in obscurity. He was forced to face something far worse than public shame: reflection. For the first time in his life, he saw the faces of the people he had sentenced, not as statistics, not as numbers in a case file, but as human beings who had lived with the weight of his decisions. He had spent so long believing that justice was something he alone had the right to define, that he had never stopped to question whether he had ever truly understood it. He saw now. And it was too late to change what he had done. But it wasn't too late to understand it. And Olivia Carter? She moved forward, unshaken, unrelenting. She had never needed revenge. She had needed change. She continued her work, ensuring that the cracks in the system were no longer ignored, that justice was no longer wielded as a weapon against those who had never been given a fair chance. She didn't think of Thomas Hamilton often, not because she had forgotten, but because he no longer mattered in the grander fight for justice. His fall was not the victory was in ensuring that no one else like him would ever be able to rise unchecked again. And so the world continued. The courtroom remained. The gavel still fell. But this time, justice was no longer the possession of one man. It belonged to the people. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. But now, let's talk about it. What does justice truly mean? Is it about power, or is it about fairness? Is it about those in authority, or about those who have been denied their rightful place in the system? And most importantly, what happens when those who have long controlled justice are finally forced to face it themselves? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Olivia Carter's position? Do you think Thomas Hamilton got what he deserved? Let's talk about it. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist, where we bring you the most gripping, unexpected, and powerful stories that make you question everything. See you in the next one.